Today on the show, we've spent, innumerable hours brushing up on our Chakobsa and Duolingo and updating our LinkedIn pages to reflect that work. I'm sure, Abu, that speaking the, assassin's battle language from Dune.
That's right.
Is going to be very helpful in landing that big tech Silicon Valley job.
Yeah, I'm going to kill that job interview.
Oh, I see what you did there. I'm going to poison the interviewer. Wait. Wait. I don't think, wait.
Hold on.
Wait.
Welcome to Gom Jabbar, your guide to the iconic world of Dune. We'll be exploring the themes, philosophies, and characters found in the sandy depths of this vast universe, from Frank Herbert's groundbreaking novels to the adaptations on film and TV. My name's Abu.
My name is Leo.
And Leo, I hope you're ready to learn a second language today.
Finally. I tried German, Japanese, I tried Spanish, I'm learning French now. I hope it's going to be something useful. Like, are we doing, Mandarin? We're doing Arabic?
No. None of the above, actually. And it's never spoken anywhere outside of this podcast in the Dune universe.
Oh, no.
But I promise you it's super fascinating. So we're in for a treat today.
It is, yeah.
Today's conversation, today's episode, folks, is all about Chakobsa, a word many of you who have read the novels will be familiar with. And, of course, many of the languages that are spoken within the Dune universe, both in the novels and in the expanded universe. We're going to be talking about all of those things today. And this topic, actually, was inspired by a suggestion from two of our listeners.
Yeah.
So thank you to Jim and Waf. Waf?
That's the only name that they gave us.
Interesting. Okay. Waf is a Dune character.
Yeah.
Anyway, Jim, Waf, thank you so much for your email and your suggestion for this topic. I'm excited we're finally getting to it today.
Indeed. Now, some housekeeping before we jump into the main topic. Today's episode does contain some light spoilers for the first Dune book and Villeneuve's films, basically. We're not going to be talking about plot. We're not going to be talking about the big whodunits.
Right.
But some of our references aren't going to make any sense if you haven't read the book. So for the best listening experience, read the book first and then come on back. Learn about some languages.
That's right. And of course, at the top of the show, a huge shout out to our Kwisatz Haderach level patrons, Daniel Dion, Rob Silver, Roman Caballo, Jonathan Lambert, and C.R. Spruill. Wow. I should have learned thank you in a dozen different languages, so I could have said that, but I did not come prepared.
How many
today,
do we know?
How
many ways do we know how to say thank you in languages?
I know how to say it in Urdu. Shukriya.
Oh, shukriya.
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, good job. Wow.
Thank you.
Excellent.
You just said it for me, so it's easy to repeat it. I know grazie, Italian.
That's
Merci
right,
beaucoup.
grazie.
You know Spanish.
Gracias.
Yeah. Yeah. We know spasiba is Russian. And
nice.
Dziękuję is Polish. Dziękuję is Czech, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
Obrigado, Portuguese.
Yep. Arigato.
Yeah, arigato. There you go. Shishie in Chinese.
That's right.
Kamsamnida is
there
Korean.
There you go, folks. 12. I think we just came up with close to 12.
Something like that, yeah.
I underestimated us. Thank you so much to our Kwisatz Haderach level patrons in all of those languages and many more. We could not make this show without your support, and we are eternally grateful.
We really are. Yeah, I actually was at a Spotify creators event, and it was wild to just think about the support that our patrons give us, because it really is the difference between being able to do this as seriously as we do and not. So huge thank you.
Grazie.
So, grazie mille. So, today's episode, here's the game plan. We are going to be diving deep into Chakobsa, which is one of the many languages in Dune, covering its history in universe and some of the real world history that may have inspired it. Very cool. I didn't know any of this.
Me neither.
And then we'll wrap up by touching on some of the other languages found in the Dune saga and the Dune encyclopedia.
Yeah.
As much as I would love to promise that this is an exhaustive list, the more I was looking into it, the more I was finding one-off references here and there. So we'll probably miss a couple here and there, but we did a good job, I think, of getting the big ones.
Agreed.
But before we get into that, we're going to take a quick break. We have to refresh. We have to update our Duolingo apps.
Right.
As soon as they've finished updating, we'll be right back right after this.
Welcome back, folks. Let's get into it. Let's start today's conversation by diving deep into the history of Chakobsa. Now, that should be a familiar term to anyone who has read even just the first Dune novel, but certainly it's littered all throughout the Dune saga. It's referenced dozens of times in different situations. And we wanted to get into it today. What is Chakobsa? What is its place in the Dune universe? And what is the history of this language? We get a lot of really cool insight from the expanded universe that really reframes how it's used in the books.
It's true. Yeah.
But to start, let's just define the thing. Let's define Chakobsa.
Yeah.
In the terminology of the Imperium at the end of the first book, in that glossary, Chakobsa is defined as, quote, the so-called magnetic language, derived in part from the ancient Botani, a collection of ancient dialects modified by needs of secrecy, but chiefly the hunting language of the Botani, the hired assassins of the first wars of assassins. End quote.
Oh, I love that kind of stuff. Also, Wars of Assassins, capital W, capital A.
Yeah.
We talked about that briefly in our History of Assassination, or Assassins of Dune, whatever we titled that episode.
Yeah, just a couple episodes ago. We just talked about what Wars of Assassins are, so check that out.
Yeah. So the very first one had the Botani, a people. That's so cool.
That's right. Now, one of the earliest mentions in the actual Dune books of Chakobsa is in the very first book, when Jessica dusts off her old Bene Gesserit diploma that's been sitting in a box for years.
Yeah.
And she whips out some Chakobsa in her conversation with Shadow Mapes.
Yeah.
Quote, tongues are the Bene Gesserit's first learning, Jessica said. I know the Botani Jib and the Chakobsa, all the hunting languages. End quote.
Yeah.
So there it is. Jessica mentions Chakobsa being an ancient language, an ancient hunting language.
Yeah.
And that's true enough. The history of Chakobsa goes back thousands of years and is interwoven with the very fabric of Dune's imperial history, as we will come to learn today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I knew it was an old language, but, well, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the history.
Yeah.
So the first known appearance of Chakobsa as a term is tied to the very first War of Assassins, which was back in 3367 AG, which included, I think it was House Harkonnen and another house that was completely wiped out.
Right.
So who's she?
They're dead, so
doesn't even go here.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is 7,000 years before the beginning of Dune.
Right.
Pretty wild. And early on in the language Botani, so this is of the Botani people, the term meant something akin to like shop talk or like jargon, you know? Using all the terminology of your trade and no one else understands what you're talking about. And the Dune Encyclopedia actually notes, quote, there presumably may have been a falconer's Chakobsa and a carpenter's Chakobsa and so on, end quote. So Chakobsa was initially, for the Botani, just like, yeah, you're talking shop. You're just throwing around your jargon. Cool.
That's right.
Now, the language of the Botani actually died out, basically. No one speaks Botani anymore. But the assassins in particular, the assassins, the paid killers, the hired mercenaries, they had such a robust dictionary of jargon and terminology. We also see that happening in the real world with like military and stuff like that. A lot of slang, a lot of like specialized use. That vocab was so robust and so useful that it actually survived even after its parent language stopped being used. So as Botani, the language, stopped being spoken, assassins who were not even Botani were still using this Botani-rich language, which is so interesting.
Very cool, yeah.
And of course, for me, I think one of the real-world analogies that came to mind was like Latin. right? Like Latin is not an extinct language because they still speak it in like Vatican City and they still speak it some places, but it is considered, or I see it referenced all the time, as a dead language because it's no one's first language. Mm-hmm. But Latin terminology and Latin phrases are used all over the place in all sorts of languages. Mm-hmm. You can't go anywhere in Europe without seeing Latin phrases over archways and stuff like that. And people know what it means and talk about it. And in the medical field, it's all over the place. So yeah, in this case, we're seeing Latin being this very, very useful language for describing medical things. Excellent. So we use it in all of our different languages. It's great.
Yeah, that's a really great way to think about Chakobsa. I love that sort of real world analogy. It's no longer a first language for anyone, but it still certainly has made its way into many other languages and has become sort of shorthand for a lot of, jargon or shop talk, as we said earlier.
It's also, and I'm a huge nerd for languages, and I love the way that languages evolve over time. And this is another thing that when I have friends who are from, say, the more remote areas in Catalonia, the basic vocabulary can often be hard. Like if I say like, oh, an alligator, they're like, what the fuck is an alligator? But if I'm talking about like the trapezius muscle, they're like, I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's very strange to see the more complex and the more scientific the topic, the more likely is the language is going to be almost identical. I think this about, because we'll see as Chakobsa evolves over the years, how it encounters other languages and other people who speak other languages. I'm sure that's also the case, where some of the basic, simplest things, like if I was talking about a dart or a knife, that might just literally be the Botani word. But then for more complex things, maybe it is something a little bit more understandable to someone who speaks Gallic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like the Kleenex effect, where like the word just becomes the thing. Yeah. And you don't remember that maybe it came from an ancient Botani language, right? Or that it was once assassin jargon or carpenter jargon in Chakobsa 7,000 years ago. But you know what Kleenex is and you know what that is referencing. So sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's very similar. You're right. I think Chakobsa goes through that type of evolution here in the Dune universe as well. And what's interesting is the encyclopedia tells us that over thousands of years, many forms of Chakobsa begin to sort of fade away. So maybe carpenter's Chakobsa is used less and less. Falconer's Chakobsa becomes more and more specialized, used less and less commonly. Yeah. And what Chakobsa then sort of becomes attached to and is most remembered for is becoming the official secret language of professional killers. Yeah. It literally becomes a tool for mercenaries and assassins hired by great houses to conduct their craft, to kill each other, to keep their plans within plans secret from one another. It becomes this incredibly effective tool in their toolkit. And we're told as early as 6000 AG, Chakobsa went through what would effectively be its final metamorphosis, how it would be remembered thus in Dune history. Yeah. Chakobsa, around this time, came to mean, quote, any secret language, especially for military purposes, end quote. Yeah. So that was sort of the final metamorphosis of the language, all the way from its roots as a Botani language that was used by, as we stated, falconers or carpenters or other sort of tradesmen, craftsmen.
The tens of millions of falconers.
Right.
In the distant future.
Right.
It's a thriving trade. Can't automate working with birds.
No, you simply cannot. No computer could work with a bird. So that's where Chakobsa finds itself ultimately. It becomes known as just any sort of secret language. It's a sort of a blanket term for any secret language, most oftenly used for military purposes, and most oftenly used by assassins and mercenaries. Now, despite this sort of final metamorphosis, the original language of the assassins, which, as we know, borrowed from the Botani, is still alive in some of its original iterations in pockets of the universe today, in quote-unquote modern-day Dune, as we know in the books. And the clearest example we see of that is the Fremen people.
Yeah, so The Dune Encyclopedia actually notes here, quote, "The Chakobsa of the Fremen was not just the code of hunted clans living on the margin of the law, a slang of their own devising for security, but the language of the assassins," end quote. This is not just a general Chakobsa. This is not a battle language they came up with because they needed to. They are speaking the Botani Chakobsa that began being devised 7,000 years ago.
Right, the OG version of it.
The OG version. They're speaking Latin, and they're out in the middle of somewhere.
Right, Stilgar out here spouting El Pluribus Unum constantly.
Just constantly. He's like, Carpe diem, and you're like, what? And to be clear, no one is sure where the Fremen picked this up.
Yeah.
No one is sure where the Fremen encountered the Botani Jib and Chakobsa. But one possibility that's outlined is that they got it from the Sardaukar, actually, on Seleucus Secundus, where some of them were transferred. And there was this period there. We talked about it in our History of the Fremen and the Sensuni Wanderers. It's a really bloody point in their history. But it's one where multiple generations of who would become the Fremen spent time alongside these Sardaukar, who were also using this early battle language that was devised by the Botani.
Yeah.
And in fact, in Dune, Jessica actually ponders how the word sietch is a Chakobsa word, meaning, quote, a meeting place in time of danger, end quote. And the Dune Encyclopedia then suggests sietch is a Tamashek word, which is a language spoken on Seleucus Secundus.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Yeah.
The Dune Encyclopedia is also clear here that it is completely unknown how they would have learned Botani, and all of the other explanations, they're like, okay, maybe they got them from the Sardaukar. Maybe they encountered them on Bela Tegus when they were there.
Right.
We're not exactly sure, so it's a lot of speculating. And of course, historians have their theories, but nothing that is solid and confirmable with in-universe sources.
Yeah, I recall there was a line in the encyclopedia about this, how historians just aren't able to corroborate. There's no paper trail of how the Botani language made its way to the Fremen. And of course, we've covered the Fremen at length on this podcast. They have a very fraught, disjointed, and bloody history.
Yeah.
It's easy to imagine that historical records of languages was lost over the course of the Fremen finding their way to Arrakis. So all we can do is theorize.
Yeah. Also, the Fremen are an oppressed people being shoved around by those in charge. And one of the methods we've seen in the real world, and we see it in Dune, one of the methods for destabilizing a culture and making them easier to boss around is to destroy their culture and to destroy their history.
That's right.
And that was attempted on Seleucus Secundus, where they tried to erase, the Fremen identity. But, of course, we know how strong the Fremen are, and they fucking failed. So, anyway, to wrap up here, Chakobsa with the Fremen, regardless of how the Fremen got Chakobsa, how they encountered it, they clearly have use for it. And they use it all over the place as part of what seems to be a multifaceted means of communicating so that they cannot be understood. I mean, we literally see Stilgar's troop give Paul a name, a sietch name, that is unique to that sietch. So if you don't know his name is Usul, you're not one of his, friends or allies. Right. So you can see that they have throughout their culture so many levels of sort of implicit secrecy and caution.
Yeah.
So something like a coded language of battle and assassination, perfect for the Fremen culture.
Yeah, definitely. Now, to be clear, the Fremen are not the only people using a version of Chakobsa.
Right.
They are the ones presumably using it the most, and definitely tapping into that OG Botani language the most. But we are told throughout the Dune saga that a number of groups in the Imperium have adopted some form of Chakobsa or some form of Chakobsa terminology as secret languages.
Yeah.
For various uses. For example, the Great Houses have adopted the old Chakobsa ancient assassin jargon for their own uses, again, primarily for military uses. The Dune Encyclopedia actually shares an interesting anecdote about how the Sardaukar are using Chakobsa, because the Sardaukar are unique in the fact that their members come from various different backgrounds and languages.
Prison planet. It's like
Exactly.
people from all over the galaxy, yeah.
All over the galaxy. No one has like a shared heritage or shared language. So we're told in the encyclopedia that the Sardaukar had, quote, Chakobsas that amounted to a separate military language. Such a Chakobsa became part of the unit's spirit de corps,
Sure. Yeah.
furnishing a badge of membership, end quote.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Like, you have to have a common language for everything, and
Right.
you're not sitting up with your Sardaukar comrades going like, yeah, but how do you feel in the dark hours? Do you feel lonely? Do you miss home? You're not talking about that stuff. You're talking about, like, battle formations and, like, how to best kill your enemies,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it's fascinating to see it, because spirit de corps, from my understanding, like that phrase means like your sort of like loyalty to the group, to the to your battalion, to your brothers in arms, to the army, to the, you know, whatever. And so like having this shared language is sort of glue that bonds the Sardaukar together. It's something that only they can speak with each other, and regardless of what planet or culture or language they came from at some point, now they are Sardaukar.
Yeah.
Now they are part of this group, and this is what identifies them. And language plays a huge part in that, clearly. It's an interesting use of Chakobsa.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all experienced that, right? Like, you become part of an in group and you start learning the lingo, and then it is satisfying to use shorthand terms and for people to understand it immediately and to feel like, yeah, I'm part of this group.
Yeah,
Right? So, totally. Yeah.
definitely.
Now, along those lines, and along the lines of like Chakobsas that are not necessarily tied directly back to the Botani language, we have a few examples in Dune of what could be considered Chakobsas, battle languages, secret battle languages, in the sort of general sense.
Right.
And we wanted to go just through these quickly.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, they are basically Chakobsas.
Right.
First up, we have the Atreides battle language, which we get to see a few times, which is really cool. And we talked about this in our episode talking about Thufir Hawat's life, that he was a big part of building out this robust and very, very sophisticated battle language.
Yeah.
Composed of both hand signs, if you couldn't speak, or coded speech. And that latter category we see on full display in the banquet scene, where Duke Leto has to like excuse himself and go take care of some business, and he leaves Paul and Jessica in charge of like conducting the dinner. But he does so using some coded words that mean like, there's a pressing need, it's not immediate danger, I'll be back, you know, blah, blah, blah. And all of that is contained within the words he chose to use, which is very, very cool.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Now, another example we get featuring one of my favorite characters of all time is the House Fenring kind of humming tongue. And this is probably one of my favorite things that didn't make it to the movie. I'm still a little bitter about this, but I get it. Hasimir and Margot Fenring, when they show up on Giddy Prime for Feyd-Rautha's birthday, you know, gladiatorial celebration, they are talking to each other and doing this kind of like like thing, and everyone's like, God, they're so annoying. But then we find out in that chapter that they are fully communicating, having full-on conversations like, oh my God, did you see what he did? This is probably Thufir Hawat's doing. Oh, and they're figuring shit out that Baron doesn't know, and they're talking about it in front of Baron.
Yeah.
It's so cool. We don't know who else uses this type of coded speech. I get the impression this is like Hasimir and Margot. This is their thing. It's kind of the impression I get.
Definitely.
And then finally, we have Bene Gesserit hand signals, a.k.a. talking with your hands, the whole of it. Akin to, I guess, ASL, but we see it used. The scene that comes to mind is two members of the Bene Gesserit who are being listened to, are having one conversation on the surface level, spoken out loud, but then are having a second conversation using their hands and subtle hand signs.
Right.
And then delightfully, some of their spoken utterances then take on a secondary and tertiary meaning in combination with their hand signals, which is really fun. So, yeah, a few examples of in-universe things that we see that are effectively battle languages.
Right. Well, that's the in-universe history of Chakobsa. Its origins as a Botani language, its evolution and adoption by craftsmen and later on assassins, and ultimately now its current day use as a secret language of any kind that's adopted for primarily military uses. And we see it among the Fremen as one of their primary forms of communication. We see it among the Great Houses as a secret form of communication for all of the scheming that they're up to. Chakobsa clearly permeates the Dune universe in many, many interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's take a quick break, but don't go anywhere, folks, because there's still more to say about Chakobsa.
Yeah.
We put on our tinfoil hats and did some research and realized Chakobsa is a real language.
It's true.
And we dug into that history, and we're going to get into that history right after this break.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're ready to learn about real history. Welcome to Gam Jabbar, your podcast about Dune and also sometimes the real world.
That's right.
So as a fun little kind of spice morsel, calling back to our book club series, in preparing for this episode, we actually found that Chakobsa is a language. It's a real language belonging to the Northwest Caucasian language family.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of this goes back to John Colorusso's 2014 book, The Northwest Caucasian Languages, which says the following about Chakobsa, the real language. Quote, perhaps to be included in the Circassian group is the secret language of the nobility called Sheik-Warshir,
nice.
Chakobsa, or the hunting language.
Whoa.
End quote.
Whoa.
Pretty sick already. Also, Sheik-Warshir. That sounds great.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
Colorusso continues to explain that this was a secret language of princes and nobility, first recorded in 1796.
Holy shit.
And it was assumed to have gone extinct. But it is still spoken by descendants of those princes and nobles.
Damn.
Which is super cool.
Yeah, and look, that's all super fascinating, but there was a lot of terminology in there that was confusing to me personally. So I started doing a bit more research because I was like, what are we talking about? What does Circassian mean? Where is this located? What is this Northwest Caucasian region?
Yeah, like I always hear Caucasian in regards to skin tone and being white,
skin tone,
basically.
Yeah, not the Caucasian we're talking about here. Here's a bit of a history lesson on this language. And folks, this is going to get fucking wild. For clarity, the Caucasian that we're referencing here, and that John is referencing in his book, actually refers to a region of modern-day Russia that sort of borders Georgia, Turkey, and is located along the Black Sea at some points. And the Circassians that he's talking about in that quote that we shared are actually an ethnic group that is native to that region. And the history of the region, basically, is that it was fairly autonomous, as far as we can tell, until about the 12th or 13th century, after which it was, like, basically taken over by numerous people back to back to back to back, starting with the Mongols, then the Crimean Tatars, and then the Turks, and then ultimately, and up until modern day, Russia, under Peter the Great in 1785, took over this region. Now, Britannica explains the tragic fate of the native group, the Circassians. They, at first, resisted the Russians, who were trying to basically relocate them from their native lands. But, quote, almost the entire Circassian population, some 400,000 people, instead emigrated to territories within the Ottoman Empire, with many thousands perishing of starvation and disease en route. End quote.
I mean, just the parallels between like populations displaced and dying along the way and being forced out of home and house. It's like,
yeah,
it's the number of parallels here is pretty wild for sure.
The parallels are certainly interesting, but there's more. As I kept doing my research, I learned that modern-day Circassians are located across that Caucasian region that we talked about and that John was referencing. That region, of course, is in modern-day Russia at this point. But there are pockets of Circassians located in Turkey, in Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. Those are the primary areas where Circassian communities can be found. Culturally, the Circassian economy has historically been centered basically around pastoral farming of that region.
Okay.
And officially, Circassians are Sunni Muslims.
Whoa. Okay. Interesting.
So if you take all of that real-world history of the Chakobsa language and the Circassians and the Caucasian region here, we couldn't blame you for thinking that we're describing the history of the Fremen people.
Yeah, the Zensunni, for sure.
The Zensunni wanderers being relocated and moving from location to location, different pockets of them on different planets, their language and cultures evolving and being lost. And ultimately, the very clear ties that the Fremen people have to Muslim culture, Middle Eastern culture, Islamic history, and traditions.
Yeah.
All of that is super, super fascinating to consider in the context of the real history of the Chakobsa language. Of course, to be super, super clear about this, we can't claim that Frank knew any of this or that this was the actual basis of inspiration for Chakobsa or the Fremen people in his book. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know what Frank knew about real-world Chakobsa history. But it is interesting to dig up this history and see the parallels there, regardless of how much Frank might have pulled from it.
Yeah, so I'm still kind of reeling from the research I did for that Tleilaxu language thing. And it really strikes me how deeply Frank dug into the various tribes and peoples of that area. The idea that he came across these peoples in modern day Turkey and modern day Russia who were ethnically distinct and then moved around by colonizing powers. And I'm like, yeah, no, all of that tracks for me. You're right, we can't say for certain, but looking at the things that Frank clearly did research very intentionally, I think if I was a betting man, I'd drop some Solaris on that bet for sure.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to go on a bet here, and then we can grab a Ouija board and see what Frank was thinking.
Right. Wish we could talk to him and ask for confirmation.
We'll just build up 5 or 6 years of this podcast, all about this universe he built and everything, and then we'll wait for modern science to devise a way to talk to the dead, and we'll have him on as a guest. Year 7.
Our final episode.
Episode, yeah.
The ultimate.
How fucking off were we? Frank's like, I didn't think I had that shit.
What's Islam?
What is, Arabic? What is that? We're like, oh my God. I think Frank invented Arabic on his own. That's wild.
Oh, God. So there you go, folks. That is a bit of history on the real world Chakobsa language. Very fun to see those parallels with the fictional Chakobsa language that Frank uses in the Dune saga.
Yeah, very cool.
And it was fun. It was fun to go down this little trail of history about a region that I frankly knew literally 0% about before this episode.
Same.
It was fun to realize that entire cultures and peoples and histories exist in pockets of the universe that I have never once thought about.
Yeah.
And yet there is so much history and fascinating culture there.
Yeah, I saw an author talking, this was a TikTok, but I saw an author talking about incorporating cultures that are not your own in books.
Yeah, I saw your post. It was R.F. Kuang.
Yeah.
I'm reading her book, The Poppy War, right now, actually.
Oh, sweet.
It's amazing.
Yeah, so her sentiments on that idea of are you feeding into stereotypes, and are you writing from a place of not knowing, and are you writing from a place of ignorance and bias? And if so, that's damaging. But otherwise, like that is the nature of creativity, is you write into these things. And I will say, although I've been a fan now of Dune for many, many years, it is only through doing these episodes, Abu, that I'm now learning about some of these like cultures and peoples who exist in the real world.
Yes.
Who have some of the marks of these violences that have been committed against them, that I'm only now learning because of a sci-fi book in the fucking 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, props to Frank for pulling this information potentially from these places in history, so that maybe it draws some more attention to the plights of other people. It's very cool. Yeah. I like it.
It is. It is. Sci-fi, baby.
Sci-fi, baby. Robo table. So before we wrap up, that reference is going to make less and less sense to people.
It's such a deep cut. I actually can't remember where that reference is even from.
Really?
But...
Oh gosh, I remember and I cherish. But I'm not going to explain it.
Nope. If you know, you know.
If you know, you know. And one of the two hosts doesn't know. Before we wrap up, folks, there are a few other languages, as I mentioned, in Dune. So, lightning style, let's get through them and share any tidbits along the way.
Yeah.
Now, we'll start with Fremen and Gallic. But to be clear, although they do have their own sections in the Dune Encyclopedia, and although you can find like fandom pages about it, you can understand most of this stuff just from reading the books, right?
Right.
Clearly, Frank was simply borrowing words from a lot of cultures and different like languages. I like to think that he was kind of trying to paint this picture of what the thousands of languages on Earth today will kind of collide into each other to become in 20,000 years. Mm-hmm. But it's also just as likely he was like going to the the library and finding an encyclopedia of foreign words and just be like, that one, sweet. Frank is not J.R.R. Tolkien.
Right.
He's not an author who's creating just the most dense universe that you can imagine.
Right. And not even universe, but like actual literal languages. Like you can learn the Elvish language that J.R.R. Tolkien came up with from scratch. You cannot learn Chakobsa as a language.
Right.
Because Frank didn't treat it as such. He didn't treat that part of his world building as a thing he needed to construct in a way that had rules like real language does. Tolkien did.
Right.
So, a lot of these things, like, yes, Fremen language exists. Gallic is, of course, the official language of the Imperium. But what does that actually mean, and how do you actually speak it? There's really little to no information on that anywhere in the Dune universe, either in the expanded universe or in the books themselves. And I found an interesting article. The conlangers that worked on Denis Villeneuve's Part 1 and Part 2, who had to come up with the Chakobsa that we see Javier Bardem and Zendaya speaking to each other.
I think it was led by David Peterson. And I wanted to mention him at some point in today's episode.
And his partner, I think, as well. They're a couple, I think.
Yeah.
Who were the conlangers on these films. I read a really great article that basically they were like, yeah, we did our homework, and there's just like no consistency to how Frank came up with the languages in his stories. And so we created the rules.
Yeah,
like the Chakobsa we hear in the movies is like a totally reinterpreted and much more robust version of Chakobsa than Frank ever came up with. Or the Gallic that we hear, the Fremen that we hear. It has like no rules in the books, and the conlangers came up with the rules to actually form a fictional language that was consistent and usable across many different scenarios and speaking situations. So all of that is like a very long preamble to say that we're just going to rapid fire through some of these other languages in the Dune universe and share some fun tidbits that we do know about them.
Yeah. And some of these things are pretty much verifiable. Some of them are not.
Yes.
And to start off, let's talk about Fremen. And again, this is the Fremen of the books, so not as developed as the Fremen of the film movies. We should bring on David Peterson for an episode if he would be willing.
I'm sure they would be, yeah.
Fun to talk to them. But the Fremen in the language, it's clearly the Fremen are coded to be Arabic speakers from the Middle East. And the Dune Encyclopedia says about their language, hold on to your seats, folks, this is going to blow your mind. Quote, the Fremen language can be traced to the ancient Terran language, Arabia. End quote. Oh my God. No one knew.
You know what? My mind felt a little breeze.
a minor jostle. It wasn't blown? It wasn't blown wide open?
It was not, no.
Oh, well, thought that was groundbreaking news. Breaking news from Gam Jabbar. Arabic was used in devising Fremen.
That's right.
But the Dune Encyclopedia entry on the Fremen language is super dense. It talks all about how the different like phonemes and vocabulary and conjugations and stuff changed over thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
And a fun little detail about the modern Fremen language that's spoken at the time of Paul Atreides arriving on Dune, there is actually two distinct dialects, which I thought was really cool. There's Eastern Fremen and Western Fremen. And these dialects are differentiated, like many dialects, with some vocabulary and pronunciation, but also, as you can tell from their names, geography. So the Eastern group, the Eastern Fremen language-speaking people, are in places like Sietch Tabr, and this is the dialect that Paul spends his time in. So it is funny to think that after 2 years on Dune, people would be like, wow, Paul's got like a very Eastern Fremen like accent.
Right.
Again, all of our jokes about him being from Brooklyn, New York he's East Coast. He's an East Coast Fremen.
That's right. That's right.
We knew it. We called it from those early jokes.
Those LA Fremen are like, why can't you carve out my bagel for me?
That's hecka weird, bro. It's hella, I don't know Western terminology anymore. I'm a foreigner. Meanwhile, the Western dialect involved a lot more jargon and vocabulary borrowed from the smugglers, which I thought was cool, plus some sounds that make it sound more similar to modern-day Arabic, because a big part of Fremen over the thousands of years became simpler grammatically and doesn't have some of the same when you're pluralizing some of those rules that are in Arabic.
Yeah.
Well, the Western Fremen do have some of those Arabic-like sounds in their language. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say personally, the impression I got from this section is that the deep desert Fremen that we encounter throughout the first few books are speaking that sort of Western dialect.
Yeah, that tracks.
They're the ones selling spice to the smugglers, and they're the ones kind of disappearing into the sandstorms, versus the Fremen who might spend more time in the city or as close to Arrakeen as Sietch Tabr is.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That tracks. I agree.
Very cool to see that kind of, in Villeneuve's movie, it was kind of an invention of the Northern Fremen and the Southern Fremen. But it is cool to see the idea that these Sietches, although they are all one people in some ways, they are distinct. They are distinct groups that may have different vocabulary or different pronunciations or, different patterns. It's very...
Totally.
It's nice. It's cool.
Totally. It's fun to see that.
Yeah.
All right, let's briefly touch on Gallic. As we know from Dune, Gallic is the primary language of the Imperium.
Yeah.
The terminology of the Imperium, in fact, defines Gallic as, quote, the official language of the Imperium, hybrid Anglo-Slavic with strong traces of cultural specialization terms adopted during the long chain of human migrations, end quote.
Cool.
So in simpler terms, it's some sort of hybrid of English and Slavic that has specialized and evolved over time as humanity spread across the stars. Cool.
Yeah.
Now, the Dune Encyclopedia entry on Gallic basically has nothing about the history or evolution or primary uses of Gallic.
Yeah, it's unintelligible.
It's like literally like a giant vocab sheet. It's like a whole 1-page vocab sheet about Gallic that's like indecipherable because it's all made up and kind of phony. But if you are a linguistic nerd, there's some really interesting tidbits in there, and it's worth checking out if you happen to find yourself a copy of the encyclopedia.
I'd be willing to bet that whatever author wrote this part of the Dune Encyclopedia probably did some research and pulled from some real places and stuff. So
yeah,
although I am not going to spend another 30 hours researching individual words and trying to track down their etymologies, someone probably could. And you probably could find some interesting tidbits in there because they have here's a noun and here's how it's addressed in all these different ways. And it's like, cool. Where's that noun from? Have at it, listener.
Right.
Have fun. I'm
Good
not
luck.
fucking doing it.
Definitely check it out if that's sort of your cup of tea, I suppose. A fun bit of trivia we did want to share from the section about Gallic in the encyclopedia is this phrase right here, which I will attempt to say.
You've got this, buddy.
This is Gallic, folks. This is me speaking Gallic. Bradit nahidit beat guarp tau de booked.
Nice.
Which, in English, in modern day English, means a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Can you say a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush in the same vocal styling as you go? Okay.
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Bradit nahidit beat guarp tau de booked.
That's how they said it. So anytime you see Paul says something really badass, just imagine him saying, yeah, Baradit bead guarp tau nabukt.
That's right. So linguistic nerds, have fun Googling guarp tau nabukt and let us know where that's from.
Yeah.
What language did Frank borrow that from?
Sim language, the Simglish. Oh,
and that's a little bit about Gallic.
Classic. Super interesting to imagine every time one of the characters that we know and love is having these conversations that we know and love from the book, that it is this fully different language that does not exist.
Totally.
He said under his breath, Gwarp town booked. Everyone's like, whoa, can't believe he said that.
Gwarp, damn it.
Gwarp, damn it. Well, let's quickly get through some other languages, and this is really truly going to be lightning style. Because some of these, there's just like one sentence talking about them.
Totally.
So first up, we have Islamiyet, which is the language of the Tleilaxu, and is just straight up the language of Islam, that is Arabic.
Yep.
It is noted to be closer to Arabic than the Fremen language. So as the Fremen language changed over many thousands of years, Islamiyet, the language of the Tleilaxu, did not as much change, and we see that in Heretics of Dune, the 5th book.
That's right. Next up, Tylara, which is the language of Gamma Virtus the 7th, and is spoken by some inhabitants of Bela Tegus, and is one of the influences of modern Fremen. Because again, the Zensuni wanderers who became the Fremen passed through Bela Tegus at one point.
Indeed. Next up, we have Blue Hill Speech, which is the language of miners, people who mine, not people under 18, on Rima planet. And this is another influence on modern Fremen. So like Abu said, they worked alongside, I believe it was on Rosik. They worked alongside some miners, again, people who mine, speaking Blue Hill Speech. And it's unclear, to be clear, if Blue Hill Speech is a full language or if it's just like a set of jargon similar to, Chakobsa. Right. But it is at least one of the languages referenced.
Next up, Bodrian, which is a major language of the planet Placentria. And in the Dune Encyclopedia, this is kind of interesting. Bodrian is described as having, quote, over 300 kinship terms describing age, sex, lineal descent, generation, and degree of distance from the most prestigious family member, plus more terms used when status is unknown or doubtful. End quote.
That sounds like a fucking pain in the ass.
What? Distance from most prestigious family member? Are you kidding?
Can you imagine if someone, every time your like cousin talked to you, they had to talk to you in regards to your most prestigious family member?
Oh my God. How do you even define that? Who is the most prestigious?
So stressful. I'm sure they have ways.
I'm sure, yeah.
I remember learning Japanese, and like you get up to a certain point in Japanese and you're like, oh, this is like such an approachable, easy language. And then you get to keigo, the language of honorifics, where you're like, okay, but if the person you're talking to is a salary level higher than you, you have to use this whole collection of 200 different verbs. And you're like,
wow,
excuse me, what?
Yeah. I mean, I watch a lot of anime and I still have not parsed when to use chan or like the honorifics
sama,
that are
sama,
chun.
The suffixes for,
I thought I knew at one point, and then a Japanese friend of mine, I asked her, and she tried to explain it to me, and I realized I had no idea.
Languages, man. Languages. Bodrian. It's the worst to learn on Duolingo. And our final one, this is the craziest of all, folks. Farsi.
Wait a second.
That's just Farsi. It's literally the language Farsi. And for our listeners who speak Farsi, I'm happy to tell you, your language lasted for quite a while.
Oh, yeah.
Unchanged, as it seems. According to the Dune Encyclopedia, Farsi was spoken in the Isfahan area of planet Poratrin. So if you've heard of planet Poratrin and you're a Farsi speaker, that's your planet. That's the planet you got to after being on Terra, if you wanted to leave Terra, I guess. But the language actually became extinct. No one speaks Farsi anymore since about 7,000 BG. So 7,000 years before Guild, 7,500 years before Guild.
Yep.
Again, that's about 17,000 years before the beginning of Dune. So there it is. But, lasted longer than English.
True that.
Pretty good. I'll also say Planet Portrin was settled by the Zensuni after they were forcibly uprooted by, the Empire in charge. And it was about 2 million nomads, right? We talked about this in the Zensuni Wanderers episode.
Exactly, yep.
But I imagine just like the indigenous peoples of North America didn't consider themselves one people. I imagine the Zensuni was also a collection of different nomadic groups that probably spoke a spattering of different languages.
Certainly. That
early on probably was pretty chaotic, and thus you have languages like Farsi included within that. And then later on, it kind of fell to common denominators, which might have just been Arabic.
Yeah.
So anyway, very interesting. Those are the other languages that we see in the Dune universe. Farsi, Bodrian, Blue Hill Speech, Tylara, and Islamiyat.
That's right. Wow. We've covered a lot of ground here today.
Yeah, it's true.
And I'm kind of having an existential moment realizing that everything we speak is way more convoluted and confusing than I thought.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't have a grasp on anything I say. Because what am I even saying? And how am I saying it?
just you have a coming to God moment with spoken language on a podcast. You're like, I don't know how words work anymore. And I'm like, sorry, dude, we've got 15 minutes left of this episode. You have to know for another 15 minutes. You can deconstruct language. Gwarp, damn it. Did you see the English adjective order thing?
No.
To your point, there's a thing that kind of circulated recently for English speakers. There is an order of adjectives, and this is a rule that we don't break as native speakers, but that feels almost arbitrary. And the order is opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, and purpose. And that sounds crazy, but just using a couple of those, if we say size, shape, color, we would say a big round couch, not a round big couch.
Whoa.
Right? You'd say a big blue Persian couch, not a Persian big blue couch, or a big Persian blue couch. Feels weird. A big blue Persian couch is the only order that feels right to native speakers. And that is, again, opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, and then purpose in that order.
Wow.
And it's wild.
Damn.
Yeah. It's pretty nuts.
That's nuts. And again, feels so natural if you're a native speaker.
Yeah.
But certainly something I imagine people might struggle with coming from a different language.
Yeah. They go, why does that sound weird? And we go, I don't know, man. It just sounds weird. Well, Abu, we've talked about languages. We've talked about Chakobsas. And we learned today, along with our listeners, that Chakobsa can be kind of shop talk jargon of any battle, assassination field. And we know there's nothing as cutthroat as podcasting.
Oh, for sure.
So if every industry has its Chakobsa, in podcasting Chakobsa, what is an existing term that you like or one that you wish we had?
Oh.
Or, maybe just what are your thoughts? What is podcasting Chakobsa?
Yeah, that's super fast. I love this question that you came up with. This is super fascinating. And I do have a new term that I'd like to coin and officially introduce into the podcast lexicon that I'll share in a little bit. But I just wanted to mention that I have worked in production and audio and video production my entire adult career. And it's actually kind of funny because the terminology that you use in this field is like so Chakobsa coded. Every term is like so stupidly military-esque in some way.
Yeah.
Think about it. Microphones.
Okay.
There are shotgun microphones
Yeah.
that you, on a film set, hold up with a boom stick or a boom pole.
Yeah.
And sometimes on this shotgun microphone, you put a dead cat to protect against wind.
A dead cat?
That's what that fuzzy thing on
The windscreen is called a dead
windscreen.
cat?
It's not called a windscreen on a film set. It's called a dead cat.
It's the same number of syllables. You know what I mean? Saving time. It's also way smaller than a cat. That's like a dead ferret.
It's truly unhinged. Of course, a lot of film equipment, at least in my time when I've used it for traveling and stuff, is packed away in like industrial strength Pelican cases like you would like a rifle, perhaps.
My Neumann microphone came in a steel attaché case, and I'm like,
exactly.
Oh my God, I don't think I could bring this to the airport.
The film industry is like so horny to be the military.
Yeah.
Some other quick examples I want to rattle off. You shoot with a camera so that you can capture the shot, but, Leo, be careful. You don't want to break the axis of action.
Sure.
Which is just known as the 180-degree rule when you select your camera angles. That's absolutely hilarious. A writer might have a kill fee built in if their project gets canceled at some point. A gaffer on set maybe has to run you out a stinger, otherwise known as an extension cord.
Does a stinger glow when there are like goblins present or orcs present or something?
No, it's just an extension cord.
It's just a cable.
It's just a cable, but we got to call it a stinger because we're so horny to be the military. It's very funny. Yeah. My time on like video productions and film sets was absolutely hilarious because you're just saying all of this like weird military Chakobsa coded jargon all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Podcasting, luckily, is a bit more tame, I will say. Like now that I'm sort of in the radio industry world, there's certainly some weird terms, but it's a bit more tame and less like aggro with all the military words.
Right.
But as promised, to wrap up here, I do want to introduce a term. And in the tradition of keeping it Chakobsa coded and very military coded, I chose the word strafing.
Okay.
Originally, in German, strafe means to punish. And in World War I, English-speaking soldiers adopted that term to mean bombardment. That's typically how you and I would use it and know it today.
Sure.
To strafe is like a bombardment run. How I'd like to introduce it into the podcasting lexicon is for when a goddamn episode begins. And I click on the episode, and the episode says, today we're going into the history of coffee beans.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, fascinating. Can't wait to learn about coffee beans.
For sure, same.
And then I hit play on the episode. And then for the next 27 and a half minutes, the host is talking about his camping trip with his family last weekend. And the episode starts with them saying, how was your weekend, my guy? Tell me all of... And I'm like, I'm here for the history of coffee beans. Yeah. What are we talking about? Why do I care about your kid being allergic to marshmallows?
It's also rough because I listen to some podcasts that are like world history and world news, and it'll be like, so today we're going to be talking about the horrific like genocide and all this stuff. And before we get into that, did you see that sports game on Friday? Like, oh man, like that's
God.
Oh yeah, and going camping this weekend. Oh, very cool, nice. Where to? Great.
This is such a personal pet peeve of mine.
Strafing.
And it again, the history of podcasting comes from radio, comes from talk show, comes from blah blah blah, and so like so many shows inherit this idea that they need to like talk about themselves or something, and not just like get to the main focus. Or create like a tight, focused, scripted research product, whatever. That's my personal beef. Yeah. I could talk about that forever. I'd like to call that, when podcasts do that at the beginning, waste my time with all of this nonsense, strafing. It is the act of strafing. You are punishing me with a bombardment run of your bullshit that's not about what I'm here to learn. Strafing. there you go, folks. When a podcast wastes my time at the start, they're strafing.
Pull back the curtain a bit for listeners. As we kind of developed Gom Jabbar and over the first couple of years, that first few minutes of the episode started getting longer and longer. As we had more and more housekeeping, I felt firsthand Abu's resistance to strafing. He was like, we're getting close. We've been 4 minutes and we haven't started talking about the thing we promised people we'd talk about.
Breaking out in hives.
What are we fucking doing? So I am so glad to now have a term for this, that we've been avoiding strafing this whole time. Yeah. And we will continue to as best we can.
And podcast listeners, longtime podcast listeners know exactly what this is. But if you're a fairly low-key, normie podcast listener, you'll start hearing this everywhere.
Yeah, true.
Pay attention. So many shows will do this strafing run at the start for no reason. Yeah. And it's unnecessary. They could cut that and the episode would be 10 times better.
I mean, again, I think me getting into, when we started making this podcast, listening to some of the other Dune podcasts, but also just sci-fi podcasts, they'll have a targeted episode and then they talk about something else for 45 minutes. And I'm like, I really chose to listen to this episode based on the title.
Yeah.
And I feel lied to. So strafing.
Yeah. Okay.
Excellent.
So there we go. I'd like to introduce that officially into the world of podcasting.
Hell yeah. Cool.
What about you? I'd love to hear your answer to this question as well.
Yeah, well, I'm a lot newer to the industry. I've production industry only a few years now. But one of the podcasting production Chakobsa words I've picked up from you is TK.
Yes.
And I remember talking to you about this one time because you put it in all of our scripts where it's like, okay, here we're going to talk about chapter 11. And you just have TK. And I was like, okay. What is that? And I understood from the way you were using it, this is TBD. This is we're going to fill in something later. Something else is going to be here before we're ready to roll. And I assumed that this related to the etymological tradition in English going back to the 19th century. That is the origin of the word okay. Goes back to basically, I think it was 1839 or something like that. And it was someone writing all correct, OLLKORRECT. So all correct, but written all correct because it was just very funny to them to write weird misspelled shortenings of things. And so, okay, the abbreviation was all correct or all correct. So someone says, hey, is everything okay? Is everything all correct? Is everything good? And you say, okay.
Wow.
I
didn't know
everything's
this.
all correct.
Whoa.
Same thing. They did another one that didn't stick was Nuff Said. They spelled it KNUFF. SAID. So it was KS was Nuff Said. There were a few others and all very silly, but okay stuck.
Yeah.
And we still have okay.
Oh my gosh.
When I started seeing TK in the script, I was like, okay, my guess is that TK stands for to come, to come later, and is the same thing. Is it's misspelled on purpose from the 1840s for fun, and then it's stuck just okay. And as it turns out, it does mean, as you know, it does mean to come.
Yep.
But it's a fucking coincidence. It doesn't have anything to do with the 1840s and any of that. And in fact, it's a much more recent reason. TK doesn't happen in English that often.
That's right.
TC, the abbreviation for if I were to spell to come correctly, does happen. Like the word hatch or match or, whatever. A lot of TCH words exist.
Right.
So if I were a producer and I wrote a script and I put a TK somewhere in the script, and I was about to send the script off for publication, it is much easier to do Command F or Control F and see any TKs left in the script. It's very easy to search for TK.
Yeah.
I think that's so fucking cool.
That's so cool, yeah.
It's this sort of weird parallel language development that looks like okay on the surface and kind of works with the same rules, but is in fact due to word search and trying to optimize my ability to find remaining placeholders.
Yeah. Honestly, a form of Chakobsa as far as I'm concerned.
Totally.
It's a hyper specialization that grew out of an industry that needed to do something particular.
Totally.
And it grew out of the tools that industry used. And it came from a more commonly, Botani turned into the assassin's jargon, turned into the Fremen language. TK came from the words to come in English, the abbreviation TC.
Yep.
Mix that with all the tools of producing and script writing, and we end up with TK. And it's fascinating.
It was only through treating the search function, it's only through treating that with the Amtal role, finding its breaking point and its weaknesses, that they learned to adapt their language to match the tools.
Yeah, right. And now you Scrabble folks out there also know, if you got the letters TK, that's a tough one to combine together.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I really don't think this is a contestable Scrabble word. Yeah, you're right. So now you know, if you draw the letters T and K, you're kind of fucked. Use them separately.
Right.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
right. Use them separately.
Unless you've got the letters for latke. So latkes are delicious. So yes, in short, publishing, podcasting, Chakobsa term that I love is TK.
Yeah,
and absolutely, it's a recent innovation. Seems like I wasn't able to find it.
It's unlikely it existed before Command F existed, right? Before you could search a digital document.
Right.
What would be the purpose of writing out by hand TK?
Yeah.
So yeah, a modern evolution of language, which again, like as I'm having this real-time existential crisis about language, I'm just realizing how much is just like randomly made up.
Yeah.
For completely unrelated or random reasons, but then becomes part of the culture. And of course, we've seen the internet cause an explosion of that kind of randomness and slang, and how then it permeates into the real world. And then Merriam-Webster makes it official, and it comes full circle, and they jokingly tweet about it. And then now it's an official term, but it's uncool now. Like, it's very, very fascinating. Linguistics is truly wild stuff.
Yeah. I saw a conversation recently about raw dogging. And this sounds crass, but folks, listen up. It was, but
listen up.
But so too were other things like that sucks. That sucks. You can say that really sucks in a somewhat polite conversation, even though the origin of the term goes back to a very specific sexual act. The word raw dogging is now being used by Gen Z and by Gen Alpha and by like young people about just doing something without without the proper tools, or just got going for it.
That trend of guys who are raw dogging 8-hour flights.
Yeah.
No headphones, no exactly. Entertainment, no.
He's raw dogging public transit, no headphones. My guy, what are you doing? But like, exactly. So right now in the common vernacular, almost there. In like 10 years, I can almost guarantee it's going to be a similar. It's going to be.
Yeah.
It moves so quickly. It's right. Wild.
Languages, baby.
We're just raw dogging this podcast.
We're just raw dogging this podcast.
Woo, man. Okay, there's too much to say. Let's wrap up. Before we let you go, dear listener, we want to remind you of some ways to support the show and keep in touch with us, be it with protection or raw dogging. And two of the best ways, of course, is one, to become a patron over at patreon.com/GomJabar, or get some Dune-themed swag from our merch store. Our links are in the show notes. Great way to support what we do and also get yourself something cool.
Yes. And of course, a reminder that we love to hear from you. So email us, gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com. Yeah. Send us your thoughts. Send us your questions. At this point, people are just sending us biographies of their pets, like nothing to do with Dune.
That's sweet.
Here's my cat, and when I adopted them, and the funny quirks it has. Love it. More of that, please.
Yeah, sure.
And of course, in particular for today's episode, if you are some sort of language expert, or you know a language that's in Dune that we didn't catch here today or mention today, please email us. We'd love to know your background, and we'd love for you to share your knowledge about the things that we either didn't cover today or didn't know about.
Yeah.
gomjabarpodcast@gmail.com. That's the place, folks.
That's the place. Yeah. Now that David Peterson's made a Fremen language, like a complete Fremen language, they probably could put it onto Duolingo. And
yes. And my gosh, they could.
Babel and stuff. Because didn't they do Duolingo for like Elvish and
yes.
And there was the one from Star Trek.
Klingon.
That's
you can learn Klingon in Duolingo, I think. And yeah, you can definitely learn Tolkien Elvish.
Yeah. It
would be cool if Fremen Chakobsa made its way onto Duolingo. Maybe that'll be like a promotional cross promo thing for Dune Part 3.
Yeah, could be. Yeah. That'd be cool.
I would love that.
Yeah. In the meantime, all we've got is Baradit, Neheldit, Bleed, Gorp, Taunabukt. I'm always saying that, Abu. You know I'm always saying that, you know.
Constantly.
Baradit, Neheldit, Beed, Gorp, Taunabukt, you know.
All the time. All the time.
All the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I have to explain to people.
It means a bird in the hand is it?
Right. And then the conductor always has to be like, please, you two need to get off this train. You're becoming a safety hazard.
Can't keep raw dogging this train like that. It's sociopathic. Well, friends, there is no real ending. It's just the place where you stop the recording. But this podcast is always one step beyond logic. So help spread the word of Muad'Dib and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And be sure to check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. We're also on TikTok at Gomjabar Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, whoever controls the podcast controls the universe. We'll see you on the golden path.